When people ask me how I became a shame researcher, I tell them that my career was built around one sentence. You cannot shame or belittle people into changing their behaviors. When I was in my 20s, I worked in a residential treatment facility for children. One day during a staff meeting, the clinical director, who oversees the therapeutic work done with the children, spoke to us about helping the kids make better choices. He said, "I know you want to help these kids, but you must understand this. You cannot shame or belittle people into changing their behaviors." He went on to explain that regardless of our intentions, we can't force people to make positive changes by putting them down, threatening them with rejection, humiliating them in front of others, or belittling them. From the moment the words were spoken, I was absolutely overwhelmed by this idea. For weeks, I thought of little else. Yet no matter how long and hard I thought about it, or how many times I repeated the statement out loud, I couldn't get my head around it. There were minutes when I thought it was, at best, pie in the sky, wishful thinking. And then there were brief seconds when I believed it was the truest thing I'd ever heard. But despite my confusion, I recognized that there was something incredibly important about understanding shame. As it turned out, I spent the next 10 years of my life researching shame and its impact on our lives. I eventually left my job at the residential treatment facility to attend graduate school. Over the next 7 years, I earned master's and doctoral degrees in social work. My entire education was driven by that powerful proposition: you cannot shame or belittle people into changing their behaviors. I wanted to understand how and why we use shame. I also wanted to understand the consequences of attempting to use shame to change people. It's not that I publicly studied shame. I just listened, learned, and tested every piece of new information against that proposition. Here's what I have learned. Can you use shame or humiliation to change people or behavior? Yes and no. Yes, you can try. In fact, if you really zero in on an exposed vulnerability, you could actually see a very swift behavior change. Will the change last? No. Will it hurt? Yes, it's excruciating. Will it do any damage? Yes, it has the potential to scar both the person using shame and the person being shamed. Is shame used very often as a way to change people? Yes, every minute of every day. I also learned that most of us, if not all, have built significant parts of our lives around shame. Individuals, families, and communities use shame as a tool to change others and to protect themselves. In doing this, we create a society that fails to recognize how much damage shame does to our spirit and to the soul of our families and our communities. One reason we don't see the connections between our personal struggles and larger cultural issues goes back to the silent part of silent epidemic. We do not talk about shame. We experience it, we feel it, we sometimes live with it for an entire lifetime, but we don't talk about it. When was the last time you had a meaningful conversation about shame? If you're like most people, the answer is never. Despite our society's relatively new openness to discussing other emotions like fear and anger, shame remains taboo. I think it's important to understand that it's not just plain folk who avoid the topic of shame. It's also mental health professionals, researchers, physicians, and other professionals who are often the ones we depend on to identify and spark the first discussions about social epidemics. After I completed the first component of my research, I spent several months traveling across the nation, presenting my work to helping professionals. For many of them, even those who had been in medical or psychotherapy practices for decades, it was their first time attending a workshop on shame. On their feedback forms, many of the participants wrote that it was one of the most personally difficult workshops they had attended. And for many of the attendees, it was their first exposure to shame research. Unlike many of the other topics that professionals study, there is no us and them when it comes to shame. As professionals, we don't have the luxury of thinking, let me learn about this topic that affects my patients so I can help them. Shame is universal. No one is exempt. If we can't talk about shame and examine the impact it has on our own lives, we certainly can't be helpful to others. Of course, there are some researchers and practitioners doing very important work on women and shame. June Tangney and Rhonda Deering, researchers and clinicians at the Stone Center at Wellesley. Harriet Lerner and Claudia Black, to name just a few. However, it's been my experience that the topic remains as silenced in the mental health community as it is in the community at large. This professional silence is important to understand because there are studies that identify shame as the dominant emotion experienced by mental health clients, exceeding anger, fear, grief, and anxiety. So, if the mental and public health communities aren't talking about shame, or providing enough safe spaces for people to get help with shame issues, how do we ever begin to talk about it? How do we confront a feeling or experience that, by its very nature, is something we don't want to talk about?